Greetings, my fellow freaks and weirdos, I'm Tom, and welcome to Monster Gab, where we love to talk about classic and vintage horror. And in today's episode, I want to share with you what I believe are the top 5 very best Amicus non-anthology horror movies. I recently made a video on the best Hammer horror movies, check that out if you haven't done so already, and thought it was only fair to cover the works of Amicus. After all, Amicus is very similar to Hammer, as in they were a British film company in their prime during the 1960s and 70s. They're mostly recognised for their movies of horror and shared a likeness to Hammer in their visual style too. Not to mention, many actors who featured in those Hammer horror movies also appeared in films for Amicus, with the likes of Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, Ingrid Pitt, even Michael Ripper. I often joke and say Amicus is a poor man's Hammer, but it is only a joke and not really fair to say, as Amicus really did make some very good and solid horror movies, or at least I think so anyway. Amicus were also widely known for their anthology horror movies, also known as portmanteau or omnibus films. These were essentially a bunch of short stories, or a bunch of bite-sized horror movies if you like, put together to make one big feature film, and Amicus made a fair few of these. I would also argue that they are the greatest works of Amicus, so you're probably wondering why I'm not covering them in this video. I have 2 reasons for this. Reason 1, even if I did a top 10 list, the anthology movies would literally take up the list. Or at least my list anyway, which leaves little room for Amicus's other works, which brings me to reason number 2. Amicus made a handful of regular non-anthology horror movies that I believe don't get talked about enough, and I think they deserve just a little more attention. Perhaps not enough to make a top 10 list, but here is, in my opinion as a long-time fan, my own list of what I believe are the very best top 5 Amicus non-anthology horror movies. Let's do it!
Number 5.
The Beast Must Die, 1974. There's a bit of a gimmick to this movie, but an interesting one. Calvin Lockhart plays the role of an eccentric and wealthy hunter who has invited 6 guests to stay in his mansion for the weekend, only it appears that one of the guests is actually a werewolf. What are the odds? The movie encourages the audience to play detective and work out who the werewolf is. There's even a 30-second pause towards the end, which the movie's narrator calls the werewolf break, where you, the audience, are given one last chance to have a guess. It's by no means a perfect movie, perhaps lacking rewatch value, especially due to the interactive concept of the film, and the wolf being played by a German shepherd due to the low budget is a tad comical. But there's a handful of deaths, a bit of action, and some interesting characters played by the likes of Peter Cushing, Marlene Clark, and Charles Gray, and the first time watch is kind of fun. An interesting take on the whodunit murder mystery style of movie. Let's make the killer a werewolf. Why not?
Number 4.
Madhouse. Again, 1974. Also known as The Revenge of Dr. Death, this one stars both Vincent Price and Peter Cushing. Paul Toombs, a popular actor in a series of horror movies as the character Dr. Death, spends several years in a mental hospital after his fiancée is discovered murdered. Though a killer was never found, it's heavily implied that Paul Toombs is a likely suspect. After a period of time, Paul is encouraged to reprise his role as Dr. Death for a new movie, but while this takes place, another string of murders starts to occur. Paul Toombs is played by the legendary Vincent Price, which is fascinating because it almost feels like he's playing as himself. There are many clips in this movie of the films Paul supposedly featured in, only they are actually clips taken from a number of Vincent Price movies. Madhouse has a bit of a dream-like feel to it and is a bit weird, making it tongue-in-cheek to a degree. But I really like it for what it is and its quirkiness. Things like an extreme lack of blood where one of the victims was decapitated makes me chuckle. but I find a lot of charm in that too. However cheesy this movie is, I believe a lot of it is intentional, almost like a tip of the hat to some of Vincent Price's earlier works. You only need to see films like The Tingler or House on Haunted Hill to know what I mean. Still, I like the music in this one and the mystery thriller elements. I also like the ghoulish looking mask worn by the killer, which I found to be frightfully intimidating. Peter Cushing, as great as he is, doesn't have a lot to offer for my liking, but to see him share scenes and dialogue alongside Vincent Price is still a treat and worth checking out.
Number 3.
Eye Monster, 1971. Interestingly enough, this is an adaptation of Robert Louis Stevenson's novella Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Only, for reasons I genuinely don't know, the characters' names have been changed, and the movie's title, Eye Monster, is a curious one. Christopher Lee stars as Dr. Marlowe, the movie's equivalent to Dr. Jekyll, a psychotherapist who has invented a formula that can supposedly release the inhibitions of his struggling patients. Eventually, he tests the formula on himself, which causes his appearance, and more so his personality, to change dramatically, releasing an alter ego known as Mr. Blake, the movie's equivalent to Mr. Hyde. Mr. Blake is a madman and a criminal, and each time his character is released, his crimes become more and more sinister, if not deadly. Besides the character names, there are a few other subtle changes from the original source material. Otherwise, this is a rather faithful adaptation. Christopher Lee is marvellous as both Dr. Marlowe and Mr. Blake. He delivers a stern, charismatic performance as Dr. Marlowe, which is a familiar brand when it comes to Christopher Lee's style of acting. But it's his rendition of Mr. Blake that I find compelling. The menacing, cheerful grin and playful nature is not something I'm used to associating with many of Christopher Lee's characters. Lord Summersisle from The Wicker Man is perhaps the closest I can recall. But here, as Mr. Blake, it's shocking to see. And because of this, I found him to be unsettling, frightening even. When we see him as Mr. Blake, it's almost comical, as there is a humorous approach perhaps, if not uncomfortable. Peter Cushing is also in this movie, but the focus really is on Christopher Lee. A fine movie in my opinion, also visually splendid, period-based with great settings, proper Victorian era stuff.
Number 2.
The Skull, 1965. I should probably have mentioned earlier that Peter Cushing is in every single one of these movies, by the way. Once again alongside fellow actor Christopher Lee, only Cushing takes the lead role in this movie. And he plays the part of Christopher Maitland, a collector of macabre antiques and artifacts related to the occult. He is soon in the possession of a human skull, supposedly the skull of Marquis de Sade. I'm assuming you're all brushed up on your history. It's also apparent the skull is cursed with the powers of evil spirits, and anyone in its possession will likely experience hallucinations, be driven to complete madness, and possibly even death. Cushing is excellent, as you would expect, as is Christopher Lee for what little role he has. But Patrick Wymark also does a good job as Marco, a sort of dodgy wheeler and dealer. I found his character to be interesting and adds more dynamics to the movie. The movie is set in modern day, or at least as modern as the movie was made in 1965, but I love the opening sequence which takes place in the 19th century. It's tremendously authentic and gothic, with a morbid grave-digging scene to boot. It's very reminiscent of something you would see in a Hammer horror movie, and you'd be forgiven for thinking you were watching one. I really like the dialogue, especially the scenes with Cushing and Lee, and I adore the use of colours and lighting, particularly during the movie's dream sequence, better described as a nightmare. It starts off casual, you wouldn't even know it was a dream to begin with, and then it just spirals into complete madness. A scene that's rather tense and uncomfortable, if not truly entertaining. Some of the effects haven't aged too well, let's say. There's a particular scene where the skull is floating in the air, and you can see the wires holding it up. But that's all part of the charm. The movie actually looks great, with excellent set designs. I genuinely love this movie, and it almost made my number one spot, but second place is still a respectable position, I think. Hey horror fans, this video is sponsored by Zealous Rebellious Clothing, who believe in encouraging self-confidence, self-expression, and the pursuit of passions without compromise. Based in North Wales, they use their passion for classic cars, music, film, and societal non-conformity to inspire their designs. With hoodies, t-shirts, hats, and much more in men's, women's, and kids' sizes, using only quality materials and prints. Be different, be rebellious. Zealous Rebellious Clothing. Check out their website, Facebook page, and other socials. Links in the description below. Before I reveal what I believe is the best Amicus non-anthology horror movie, I'd like to give a few honourable mentions. Many claim City of the Dead from 1960, also known as Horror Hotel, to be an Amicus movie. Some will say it's Amicus's first movie. Others state it's technically an Amicus movie. That's because it was made by the same people who founded Amicus. However, Amicus wasn't founded until after this movie came out. Nowhere in the credits does it mention Amicus, therefore it's not an Amicus movie. If it was, it would definitely have made the list because I absolutely love City of the Dead. It's an excellent film, I highly recommend it, and so with that in mind, I will give it an honourable mention at least. But it's not Amicus. The Deadly Bees from 1967. In my opinion, there are far better bug movies, or creepy crawly movies, whatever they're called. I'd also say this isn't even the best killer bee movie out there. The story is okay, but the effects have heavily dated. It has its fans, and for those who wish to tick off all the Amicus movies, it's still worth checking out. What Became of Jack and Jill from 1972. This is often listed as British horror, but as far as horror is concerned, I'd have to strongly disagree. It's good. I only watched it for the first time recently and enjoyed it, but I'd say it's more of a psychological drama than anything. Good acting too. But still, it didn't feel like a horror movie to me, and that's the only reason why it doesn't make the list. The Psychopath from 1966 is another movie often listed as horror, which I kind of understand with this one, though I'd say it's a murder mystery crime thriller myself. However, it does have strong elements of horror, and wow is it creepy. Creepy dolls throughout the majority of the film, and that ending too, yeah, creepy. I enjoyed it at the time of watching it, but I don't think I'd ever feel the need to watch this movie again though. Scream and Scream Again from 1970. Wait, this movie stars Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing and Vincent Price within the same film, made by Amicus, and has the word Scream twice in the title? Surely this has to be the greatest classic horror movie ever made, right? Well, although their names are top of the bill, Lee, Cushing and Price are barely, and I do mean barely, in it. And they don't share any scenes together apart from one technicality between Lee and Price, which literally lasts all of 2 seconds with no dialogue. Their names were used simply to sell the movie, like an early equivalent for clickbait. And as for the movie itself, well, some of you might like it, but I found it to be a bit of a mess. Still worth mentioning, I suppose. So, what do I think is the number one very best Amicus non-anthology horror movie?
Number 1.
And now the screaming starts. 1973. You'll never guess who stars in this one. Only Peter Cushing. Though his name is top of the bill and his role is a significant one, he doesn't actually enter the movie until 47 minutes in. The lead role is really played by Stephanie Beacham. She plays the part of Catherine, a bride-to-be who moves into her fiancé's family estate in the year of 1795. It's here she is haunted by a ghost with a birthmark upon his face, bleeding empty eye sockets, and a bloody stump where his missing hand should be. Hell, sometimes she's even haunted by the severed hand itself. Catherine is forever tormented, especially after she is sexually violated by the ghost on her wedding night. With the help of Dr. Pope, played by Peter Cushing, they eventually unravel the mystery of a peculiar woodsman, played by Jeffrey Whitehead, who lives within the grounds of the family estate and resembles a likeness to the ghost. They also learn of the sordid history of the home and the sad, vengeful purpose as to why this haunting has taken place. I just want to say how brilliant Stephanie Beacham is as Catherine Fenn Griffin in this movie. Yes, she's beautiful and glamorous, as were many of the women within these types of movies. And a good job was done to make sure her cleavage was particularly visible in almost every scene she's in. That's not a complaint, by the way, just observation. But she's more than just a piece of eye candy. She really owns the role of a troubled and tormented newlywed in a strange new place, desperate for answers. Peter Cushing is also great when he eventually shows up, and of course plays his character effortlessly. The movie does take its time getting to the point of explaining why these ghostly occurrences are taking place, but those occurrences do happen almost immediately and often enough to keep you entertained until the big reveal. Now, I'm not going to give away any spoilers, but it's quite obvious that something awful took place in the past, and the movie builds up to showing us what those events were, which is a very sad and disheartening scene. Some of the effects may have aged, but I genuinely think the severed hand that crawls along the floor was impressive and still looks good even now. The ghost also looks hideously creepy, at times, and the music is pretty decent too. Then there's the aesthetics, and it looks authentic, and being period based really fits with this style of story and movie. Once again, you would be forgiven for thinking it was made by Hammer. It's safe to say that I quite enjoy this movie, but putting my bias aside, I can honestly say that I do think this is the very best Amicus non-anthology horror movie. But what do you think? Anyway folks, we have come to the end of the video. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments section. Do you agree with the movies in my list, or do you disagree? Were there any movies I left out? Please do let me know. I'd love to hear from you. And I know I left the anthology movies out. Was that a bad move? I mean, I can cover those movies in another video anyway. Would you like to see me do that? Let me know in the comments section. I just thought that the non-anthology movies deserved a little more love. I don't hear enough people talk about them, and I think they're pretty good. Whether they compare well enough alongside Hammer horror movies is an opinion that I suppose many of you will let me know in the comments section. Anyway folks, that is all we've got time for in this particular episode, and until next time, I don't know who they are, but if you don't subscribe, they will get you. So make sure you are indeed subscribed, click that notification bell so you don't miss out on any new video here on Monster Gab. Like the video if you did indeed like it, share it with your friends, and leave that comment down there. Thank you so much for stopping by. Take care, see you soon, bye bye.